In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And yet, there exists a curious phenomenon that has puzzled Imperial commanders, inquisitors, and Xenos researchers for millennia. Among the countless conflicts that rage across the galaxy, there is one particular combination of combatants that almost never occurs. It is a tactical anomaly so rare that some scholars believe it to be nothing more than statistical coincidence. Others, however, see in this absence a deeper truth about the nature of warfare in the 41st millennium. The Orks, those green-skinned terrors who live for battle and thrive on carnage, will fight anyone, anywhere, for any reason. They charge headlong into Imperial Guard firing lines with reckless abandon. They gleefully engage Space Marine Terminators in close combat. They've been known to assault Tyranid hive fleets, despite being hopelessly outnumbered. They'll even fight each other when no other enemies present themselves. The Orkoid love of violence knows virtually no bounds. And yet when confronted with Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, these same violence-addicted Xenos suddenly develop a curious reluctance to engage. This is not fear, for Orks know no fear in the way other species understand it. This is not tactical wisdom, for Orks rarely employ such calculated thinking. This is something else entirely, something that speaks to the fundamental psychology of the greenskin menace and the insidious nature of the Alpha Legion's methods. To understand this phenomenon, we must delve deep into what makes Orks tick, what drives the mysterious Alpha Legion, and how these two forces interact in ways that defy conventional military logic. The Alpha Legion, the 20th and most enigmatic of the original Space Marine legions, has always operated in the shadows. Their primarch, known only as Alpharius, or perhaps Omegon, or perhaps both, built his legion around the principles of deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare. Where other legions sought glory through direct confrontation, the Alpha Legion preferred to dismantle their enemies from within, to sow confusion and doubt, to win wars before the first shot was ever fired. And their dreadnoughts, those walking tombs housing the consciousness of mortally wounded warriors, represent perhaps the most perfect expression of their philosophy when combined with overwhelming firepower. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an incomprehensible object? What occurs when beings who crave the visceral satisfaction of combat encounter opponents who exist in a state of deliberate ambiguity? The answer is not the epic clash one might expect. Instead, we find avoidance, disinterest, and a phenomenon that reveals profound truths about both species. The Orks won't fight Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, and the reasons why illuminate the very nature of warfare in the darkness of the far future. Understanding Ork psychology, the WAG, and the need for battle to comprehend why Orks refuse to engage Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, we must first understand what drives the greenskin menace. Orks are not merely violent, they are violence incarnate. They are not simply aggressive, they are aggression given form and purpose. The Orkoid species was engineered, tens of millions of years ago, by the mysterious beings known as the Old Ones. These ancient masters of biological manipulation created the Orks, or more precisely, their precursors the Krork, as the ultimate weapon against the Necrons and their Titan masters during that ancient conflict known as the War in Heaven. The Old Ones imbued their creation with certain fundamental characteristics that would ensure their effectiveness as warriors. They made them incredibly durable, with a physiology that combines animal and fungal elements to create beings capable of surviving wounds that would kill any other species. They made them naturally aggressive, with an instinctive understanding of combat and violence. They gave them the ability to reproduce through spores, ensuring that wherever Orks traveled, more Orks would follow. And perhaps most importantly, they gave them a unique psychic connection to one another, a gestalt field that grows stronger as more Orks gather together. This psychic field is the foundation of what Orks call the WAG, spelled exactly as it sounds when bellowed by 100,000 throats in the heat of battle. The WAG is many things simultaneously. It is a military campaign, a holy crusade, a migration, and a psychic phenomenon all rolled into one massive green tide of destruction. When orcs gather in sufficient numbers, their collective psychic energy begins to feed upon itself, growing stronger with each addition to the horde. This energy bolsters their confidence, sharpens their rudimentary tactical thinking, and most importantly, draws more orcs to the gathering. An orc warboss who has successfully launched a WH40K becomes something more than a mere leader. He becomes a focal point for all that psychic energy, a living embodiment of orcish violence and cunning. The WH40K energy flows through him, making him bigger, stronger, and more intelligent than he was before. His legend grows with each victory, and his legend draws more followers, which generates more WH40K energy, which makes him even more formidable. It is a cycle that can, if left unchecked, grow to threaten entire sectors of the galaxy. But the WH40K is more than just a military phenomenon. It is the very essence of orc culture, if such a word can be applied to their anarchic society. Orcs exist in a state of constant conflict, constantly testing themselves against one another and against any other species unfortunate enough to cross their path. This is not merely behavioral, it is biological. Orcs literally need combat the way humans need food and water. Without enemies to fight, without violence to engage in, orc society begins to break down. They become restless, irritable, and eventually turn on one another in increasingly destructive ways. This need for combat is genetically hardwired into every orc from the moment they emerge from their fungal birth. They understand instinctively how to fight, how to make crude but effective weapons, how to organize themselves into mobs and warbands. This knowledge is not learned, but inherited, passed down through their genetic code from those ancient Krork created by the Old Ones. An orc boy picks up a shooter for the first time and already knows how to aim and fire it. An orc mech boy can build a functioning vehicle from scrap metal and spare parts without any formal training because the knowledge of how machines work is already present in his mind. The WH40K energy also affects how orc technology functions, though this is a subject of much debate among Imperial scholars. Some believe that orc technology only works because the orcs believe it will work, that their collective psychic field literally bends reality to make their ramshackle contraptions function. Others argue that orc technology is actually quite sophisticated, built on principles encoded in their genetic memory, and that the WH field merely enhances its effectiveness. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Orc technology does work according to genuine mechanical principles, but the collective belief of the orcs can improve its performance beyond what should be mechanically possible. But here is where we encounter the first hint of why orcs might avoid certain types of combat. For all their love of violence, for all their genetic programming toward aggression, orcs are not mindless killing machines. They have preferences, instincts, and yes, even something approximating taste when it comes to warfare. An orc wants a good fight, what they call a proper scrap. This means combat that is visceral, immediate, and satisfying on a level that resonates with their fundamental nature. The WH40K energy flows strongest when orcs are engaged in the kind of combat they were designed for. Brutal melee exchanges, thunderous firefights at close range, the kind of warfare where you can see the whites of your enemy's eyes, or in the orc case, where you can see the enemy well enough to know exactly how hard you're hitting them. This is what feeds the WH40K, what makes it grow and strengthen. Victory is important, yes, but the manner of victory matters too. An orc who wins through trickery or indirect means gains less respect than one who wins through overwhelming violence. An orc who defeats his enemies without ever seeing them, without ever trading blows with them, has won a hollow victory indeed. This is reflected in how orcs organize themselves socially. The biggest, strongest orcs rise to positions of leadership not through political maneuvering or strategic genius, but through simple, physical dominance. An orc becomes a nob, one of the elite warriors who lead mobs into battle. By proving himself in combat, he grows larger and stronger with each victory, each successful fight adding to his mass and his authority. Eventually, if he is strong enough and cunning enough, he may become a war boss, commanding entire tribes of orcs. And if he is truly exceptional, if his victories are legendary and his waj are powerful enough, he may unite multiple tribes under his banner and become a warlord. This hierarchy is maintained through constant testing. Younger, smaller orcs are always looking for opportunities to prove themselves, to challenge those above them and take their place. This keeps orc society in a state of perpetual, violent flux, with leadership positions constantly being contested and confirmed through combat. It also means that orc leaders must be legitimately formidable fighters, because any orc who holds a position of authority purely through trickery or politics will quickly be challenged by someone who wants to prove their own strength. The implications of this for orc combat preferences are profound. Orcs don't just want to win, they want to win in a way that proves their superiority. They want their enemies to know they've been beaten. They want the satisfaction of direct engagement, of feeling their chopper bite into enemy flesh, of seeing their slugger rounds tear through armor. This is what validates their existence as warriors. This is what feeds the wah. This is what makes them bigger and stronger. And this is why certain types of enemies, certain types of combat, hold less appeal for orcs despite their general enthusiasm for violence. It is not that they won't fight these enemies exactly. Put an orc in a situation where he must fight or die, and he will fight anything. But given a choice, given the opportunity to select their targets and their battles, orcs will gravitate toward enemies who promise the kind of combat they crave. They will seek out foes who will give them a proper scrap, who will engage them on terms that satisfy their deep-seated need for visceral, immediate violence. The orc need for a proper scrap. Why machines fall short. Among the countless enemies that orcs face across the galaxy, there exists a hierarchy of desirability, a spectrum of how much satisfaction different foes provide. At the top of this spectrum are enemies like the Space Marines, who combine durability with the willingness to engage in close combat. Imperial Guard regiments also rank highly, particularly those that stand and fight, rather than employing excessive tactical maneuvering. Even Tyranids, despite being Xenos creatures driven purely by biological imperatives, provide the kind of straightforward, visceral combat that orcs appreciate. But there is one category of opponent that consistently disappoints the greenskin warmonger: machines. This aversion to fighting purely mechanical opponents is well documented in Imperial records, though it is often misunderstood. Orcs do not fear machines. That would be absurd. Orcs build their own machines, often quite enthusiastically. Mech boys love nothing more than cobbling together vehicles and weapons from scrap metal and battlefield salvage. Orc technology, crude though it may appear, fills a vital role in their society. So the issue is not with machines themselves, but rather with machines as opponents. The problem, as recorded in several Ordo Xenos reports and confirmed through interrogation of captured orcs, is that fighting machines lacks what the orcs refer to as feeling, or what Imperial scholars have termed visceral satisfaction. When an orc brings his chopper down on an enemy space marine, he feels the resistance of ceramite armor, followed by the satisfying crunch as it gives way to softer tissue beneath. When he fires his slugger into a charging guardsman, he sees the impact, sees the blood, sees the immediate result of his violence. These sensations confirm for the orc that he is engaged in real combat, that his actions have immediate and observable consequences. Machines offer no such satisfaction. Strike a machine, and you hear only metal on metal, see only superficial damage unless you happen to hit a critical system. There is no blood, no cry of pain, no satisfying crunch of bone or squelch of flesh. The machine does not react to pain or fear, does not show any sign of being impressed by the orc's prowess. It simply continues functioning until it is completely destroyed. And even then, the destruction is mechanical, predictable, unsatisfying. There is no moment of triumph when your enemy realizes he has been beaten, because the machine has no capacity for such realization. This lack of visceral feedback creates a fundamental disconnect for the Ork warrior. Remember, Orks are driven by deeply ingrained biological imperatives. They fight not merely to win, but to prove themselves, to grow stronger, to feel the rush of combat that validates their existence. Fighting machines provides none of these psychological rewards. It is combat stripped of all the elements that make it meaningful to an Ork. It is violence rendered sterile and unsatisfying. Consider the Ork reaction to Necrons, those ancient mechanical warriors who have terrorized the galaxy for millions of years. When Orks first encounter Necrons, they often charge into battle with their usual enthusiasm. But as the fighting progresses, as the Orks realize that their enemies are not living creatures, but rather mechanical constructs that simply reassemble after being destroyed, the enthusiasm wanes. The WH energy that normally builds during combat instead begins to dissipate. Orks who would normally fight to the death against space marines or tyrannids begin to disengage when facing Necrons, not because they are losing, but because the fight itself is fundamentally unsatisfying. The Necrons, of course, are an extreme example, being entirely mechanical and possessing the ability to self-repair through their mysterious reanimation protocols. But the same principle applies to, a lesser degree, to any predominantly mechanical opponent. Imperial knights, those towering war machines piloted by noble scions of ancient houses, certainly pose a significant threat to any Ork force. But Orks approach them differently than they approach, say, a charging squad of assault marines. The knight is a target to be destroyed through weight of firepower or swarming tactics, not an opponent to be fought in the sense that Orks understand fighting. This distinction is crucial. To an Ork, a truly satisfying fight involves personal combat, or at least combat where the personal element is clearly present. Even at range, shooting at visible enemies who react to being shot, who dodge and take cover and shoot back with evident intent, provides more satisfaction than bombarding a machine that simply continues its programmed mission regardless of how much damage it has taken. The enemy must be present, must be real in a way that resonates with the Ork psyche. Dreadnoughts present a particularly interesting case in this regard. These massive walkers, housing the critically wounded bodies of fallen space marines, occupy a middle ground between machine and warrior. On one hand, they are clearly mechanical constructs, towering engines of war bristling with weapons and armored with thick ceramite plates. On the other hand, they are piloted by living beings, or more accurately, they contain living beings who are interred within their armored sarcophagi. The question then becomes, do Orks perceive dreadnoughts as machines or as warriors? The answer, it seems, depends largely on how the dreadnought behaves and is deployed. A dreadnought that charges into melee combat, that engages Orks directly with its power fist, and demonstrates clear tactical thinking in response to battlefield conditions, is more likely to be perceived as a worthy opponent. The Ork can see that there is intelligence directing the machine, can feel in the exchange of blows that he is fighting another warrior, albeit one encased in a metal shell. This provides at least some of the visceral satisfaction that Orks crave. But a dreadnought that remains at range, that employs purely long-range weapon systems, that moves with mechanical precision rather than warrior's instinct, becomes just another machine in the Ork's perception. It is a target, a threat to be neutralized, but not an opponent to be fought in any meaningful sense. The satisfaction of destroying such a dreadnought comes from eliminating a dangerous weapon platform, not from proving oneself in combat against a worthy foe. Imperial commanders who have observed Ork behavior in battles involving dreadnoughts have noted this distinction. Ork mobs will eagerly charge a dreadnought that has been engaging them in melee, seeing it as a challenge to overcome. But those same mobs show marked reluctance to assault dreadnoughts that have been providing fire support from a distance, even when tactical circumstances would favor such an assault. The Orks can feel, on some instinctive level, that fighting the distant dreadnought will not provide the satisfaction they seek. This preference extends to all aspects of Ork combat doctrine, such as it exists. Ork warbosses, despite their limited strategic thinking, instinctively direct their forces toward enemies who promise a proper scrap. They will bypass heavily fortified positions to assault concentrations of enemy infantry. They will ignore valuable strategic objectives to charge headlong into the enemy's elite close combat units. This is not tactical foolishness exactly, though it certainly can lead to tactical defeats. Rather, it is the Ork nature expressing itself, seeking out the kind of combat that fulfills their biological and psychological needs. The WH energy itself seems to respond to this preference. When Orks are engaged in the kind of combat they find satisfying, visceral melee exchanges and thunderous close-range firefights, the WH grows stronger. The collective psychic field intensifies, making the Orks more confident, more aggressive, more effective. But when forced to engage in unsatisfying combat, such as long-range duels with artillery or protracted sieges of heavily fortified positions, the WH energy stagnates or even diminishes. The Orks become less effective, more prone to infighting, more likely to abandon the battle entirely in search of better opponents elsewhere. This creates a fascinating dynamic on the battlefield. Enemies who understand Ork psychology can exploit this preference by denying them the kind of combat they seek. Employing predominantly mechanical forces, maintaining distance, refusing to engage in close combat. All of these tactics can frustrate Orks to the point where they lose interest in the battle. This is not the same as defeating them through superior firepower or tactics. It is defeating them by removing the very reason they fight in the first place. Of course, this strategy has its limits. Orks, for all their preferences, are still extremely dangerous when cornered or when no better targets are available. A warboss who has committed his way to a particular campaign will not simply abandon it because the enemy refuses to provide satisfying combat. But he may divert his forces, may seek out other enemies in the same theater, may fundamentally alter his battle plan in search of more appealing targets. And in a galaxy torn by countless wars, there are almost always more appealing targets available. Alpha Legion, masters of deception. If the Orks represent violence in its purest, most straightforward form, then the Alpha Legion represents the exact opposite. Warfare elevated to an art form of misdirection, deception, and psychological manipulation. To understand why Orks won't fight Alpha Legion dreadnoughts, we must understand what makes the Alpha Legion unique among the Space Marine legions, both loyal and traitor. The Alpha Legion was the 20th and final legion, created during the first founding, though even this fact is shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Some records suggest the legion existed long before it was publicly acknowledged, operating in the shadows as a ghost legion, carrying out missions too sensitive or too dark to be attributed to any known force. Other records place their creation firmly in the established timeline, with the Legion only coming to prominence when united with its Primarch. Like so much about the Alpha Legion, the truth is deliberately obscured, buried under layers of misinformation and conflicting accounts. What is known, or at least what is believed with reasonable confidence, is that the Alpha Legion's Primarch was named Alpharius. But even this apparently simple fact dissolves into confusion under closer examination. Alpharius had an identical twin brother named Omegon, and the two were functionally interchangeable, sharing command of the Legion in ways that made it impossible for outsiders to determine which twin was actually present at any given time. They encouraged this confusion, cultivating an environment where any member of the Alpha Legion might claim to be Alpharius, where the identity of the Legion's leader became a deliberate mystery. This obsession with secrecy and misdirection was not mere paranoia or theatricality. It was the foundation of the Alpha Legion's entire tactical doctrine. Where other legions relied on overwhelming firepower, lightning assaults, or stoic defense, the Alpha Legion won battles before they began by thoroughly infiltrating enemy organizations, spreading disinformation, and creating conditions where the enemy defeated themselves through confusion and mistrust. They were not merely warriors, they were intelligence operatives, saboteurs, and psychological warfare specialists who happened to possess the physical capabilities of Space Marines. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare differed fundamentally from that of their brother legions. Consider, for example, the contrast with the Ultramarines. Roboute Guilliman's sons fought according to the Codex Astartes, employing well-tested tactical doctrines and achieving victory through superior organization and execution. The Alpha Legion found such methods pedestrian and inefficient. Why fight a battle when you could win the war without ever engaging the enemy directly? Why suffer casualties assaulting a fortified position when you could infiltrate that position weeks or months in advance and arrange for the gates to be opened at the optimal moment? This philosophy manifested in operations that other legions found baffling or even distasteful. The Alpha Legion would spend years infiltrating a target world, subverting its leadership, turning its population against its defenders, and generally creating chaos from within. Only when the enemy was thoroughly compromised would Alpha Legion forces reveal themselves, and even then, their assault would come from unexpected directions at unexpected times, exploiting weaknesses that the enemy didn't even know existed. The result was often total victory, achieved with minimal Alpha Legion casualties, the hallmark of their preferred operational method. But this approach came at a cost, both practical and philosophical. Other legions distrusted the Alpha Legion, viewing their methods as dishonorable or un-Marine-like. Space Marines were supposed to be noble warriors, exemplars of humanity's finest qualities. The Alpha Legion's willingness to employ deception, to work through proxies and agents, to win through trickery rather than valor, sat poorly with more traditional legions. Even the Emperor himself seemed to regard the Alpha Legion with a certain wariness, though he employed them when their unique skills were required. The Horus Heresy brought the Alpha Legion's methods into even sharper focus. When the War Master Horus turned against the Emperor, and half the Space Marine legions followed him into rebellion, the Alpha Legion sided with the traitors. But their motivations, their true objectives, and even their genuine loyalties remain subjects of intense debate among Imperial scholars. Some believe the Alpha Legion truly fell to chaos. Others argue they infiltrated the traitor forces to undermine them from within. Still others propose that the Alpha Legion serves some third agenda, neither loyal to the Emperor nor sworn to chaos, but pursuing objectives known only to themselves. This ambiguity is itself a weapon in the Alpha Legion's arsenal. Enemies cannot predict Alpha Legion actions because enemies cannot determine Alpha Legion motivations. How do you prepare for an enemy whose very allegiances are uncertain? How do you counter tactics when you cannot be sure whether the Alpha Legion forces you're fighting are the actual threat, or merely a distraction from some deeper scheme? The Alpha Legion thrives in this fog of uncertainty, using doubt and confusion as effectively as other forces use bolters and chainswords. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, the Alpha Legion has continued to operate according to these principles. They exist as a network of semi-independent cells scattered throughout the galaxy, each pursuing objectives that may or may not align with those of other cells. These cells coordinate through a system of human operatives, regular humans who have been psychologically conditioned to serve the Alpha Legion with absolute loyalty. These operatives infiltrate Imperial organizations at every level, providing intelligence and carrying out missions that further whatever grand design the Legion is pursuing. The genius of this approach is that destroying one Alpha Legion cell does little to hamper the overall organization. Each cell operates independently, possesses only the information necessary for its specific mission, and has minimal contact with other cells. Even if Imperial forces manage to locate and destroy an Alpha Legion warband, they cannot determine what that warband was trying to accomplish or what other forces might be working toward the same goal elsewhere. It is warfare through compartmentalization, ensuring that the Legion as a whole remains safe, even as individual elements are sacrificed. This brings us to the Alpha Legion's use of Dreadnoughts, which represents a fascinating intersection of their tactical preferences and the realities of space marine warfare. Dreadnoughts are typically honored ancients, revered warriors who have suffered catastrophic injuries and been interred in armored sarcophagi to continue serving their legion. For most legions, Dreadnoughts are walking repositories of tactical knowledge and combat experience, veterans whose wisdom guides younger Marines and whose presence on the battlefield inspires fierce loyalty. The Alpha Legion approaches Dreadnoughts differently. For a legion built on secrecy and individual anonymity, the concept of preserving individual warriors seems almost contradictory. Yet the Alpha Legion maintains Dreadnoughts and uses them in ways that reflect their unique operational philosophy. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought is not an honored ancient whose identity is celebrated, but rather another asset whose individual identity is deliberately obscured. The warrior interred within might be anyone, might be working toward any objective, might not even be who he claims to be. This uncertainty extends to how Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts are deployed in combat. Where other legions use their Dreadnoughts as anchors for battle lines or as spearheads for assaults, the Alpha Legion employs their Dreadnoughts as they employ everything else, as part of a larger scheme of deception and misdirection. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought might appear to be providing fire support for an assault, when its actual purpose is to draw enemy forces away from the real objective. It might engage in what appears to be suicidal combat, when its true mission is simply to create confusion and sow doubt about Alpha Legion intentions. The Alpha Legion also differs from other legions in their willingness to employ Dreadnoughts in false flag operations. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought might bear the heraldry of another legion, might broadcast vox traffic suggesting it belongs to a different force, might engage in combat patterns deliberately designed to mislead enemy intelligence services about which force they're actually fighting. This is psychological warfare at its finest, using the enemy's own assumptions and expectations against them. Records from the Horus Heresy describe Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts participating in what other legions would consider dishonorable tactics. They would withdraw from favorable engagements for no apparent reason. They would broadcast false distress calls to lure enemies into traps. They would sometimes appear to be malfunctioning or damaged when they were actually fully operational, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Where another legion's Dreadnought would proudly declare its identity and unit designation, an Alpha Legion Dreadnought might claim to be anyone or no one, adding another layer of confusion to an already murky battlefield. In the current era, Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts continue this tradition. Imperial forces engaging what they believe to be a damaged or isolated Dreadnought may find themselves walking into an elaborate ambush. What appears to be a lone ancient, separated from his warband, might actually be bait in a trap, or a distraction, while Alpha Legion infiltrators accomplish some other objective entirely. The very presence of an Alpha Legion Dreadnought on the battlefield should be cause for suspicion, because nothing about the Alpha Legion is ever as simple as it appears. This brings us to the specific question of how Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts appear to Orks. Where a normal Dreadnought, even one employed in ranged combat support, still projects some sense of identity, of warrior presence, an Alpha Legion Dreadnought deliberately obscures these qualities. It presents not as a warrior in a metal shell, but as something more machine-like, more unknowable. The Alpha Legion trains its Dreadnoughts, or, more precisely, the warriors interred within Dreadnoughts, to suppress the very qualities that might make them seem like living opponents worthy of a proper scrap. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought in combat is deliberately impersonal. It does not issue challenges or make declarations. It does not respond to Ork taunts or provocations. It simply executes its tactical objectives with mechanical precision, providing no feedback, no sense of personality, no indication that there is a thinking being directing its actions. To an Ork facing such an opponent, the Alpha Legion Dreadnought appears not as a worthy foe, but as merely another machine, another piece of battlefield equipment to be destroyed or avoided as circumstances dictate. This is entirely intentional, of course. The Alpha Legion understands that different enemies respond to different stimuli, that what intimidates one foe may embolden another, that what satisfies one opponent's sense of honor may disgust another's. Against Orks, the Alpha Legion deliberately presents its dreadnoughts as unsatisfying opponents, removing the very elements that might entice Orks to engage. It is psychological warfare targeted not at the Ork mind, which is largely immune to such manipulation, but at the Ork psyche, at those deep-seated preferences and aversions that govern Ork behavior. The Dreadnought Dilemma: Walking Tombs and Unsatisfying Combat. Dreadnoughts occupy a unique position in the armies of the Adeptus Astartes. They are simultaneously weapons platforms of tremendous power and sacred relics containing the essence of fallen heroes. For most Space Marine chapters, a dreadnought represents continuity with the past, a living link to the chapter's history and traditions. The warriors interred within dreadnoughts are venerated ancients, their wisdom sought in council, their presence on the battlefield a source of inspiration to their younger brothers. But from the Ork perspective, these venerable aspects are entirely irrelevant. An Ork does not care that the dreadnought crushing his mob mates contains a warrior who fought alongside the Primarch himself 10,000 years ago. An Ork has no interest in the tactical wisdom accumulated over centuries of combat. An Ork simply wants to know, will fighting this thing give me a good scrap? And the answer, increasingly, is no. The problem begins with the fundamental nature of dreadnought combat. Dreadnoughts are slow, ponderous machines, despite their formidable weapons and thick armor. They move with mechanical precision rather than the fluid grace of a warrior. They lack the unpredictability of living opponents, the split-second reactions that make combat exciting and uncertain. Instead, they execute pre-programmed tactical routines, responding to threats with a regularity that, while effective, is also deeply boring to an Ork. Consider the experience from an Ork's perspective. You are a nob leading your mob into battle, seeking glory and a good fight. You spot a dreadnought on the battlefield, its assault cannons spinning up, its power fist crackling with energy. This looks promising, a big tough opponent that will test your mettle. You order the charge, and your boys surge forward with the enthusiasm that only Orks can muster. The dreadnought opens fire, its weapons tearing through your mob with mechanical efficiency. Boys fall, but that is expected. Casualties are part of combat. You press onward, your chopper raised, ready for the satisfying clash of melee combat. And then, nothing. The dreadnought continues firing with the same mechanical rhythm, adjusting its aim with computer-assisted precision, showing no sign of concern at your approach, no change in behavior that might indicate a living opponent reacting to circumstances. When you finally close to melee range and bring your chopper down on its armor, you feel only metal on metal, hear only the clang of impact. The dreadnought swivels, bringing its weapons to bear at point-blank range, still mechanical, still impersonal. Even when you finally manage to damage it, to breach its armor and destroy critical systems, there is no satisfying moment of victory, no sense that you have overcome a worthy opponent. You have simply destroyed a machine. This lack of satisfaction is compounded by how dreadnoughts are typically deployed. Most Space Marine chapters use their dreadnoughts as fire support platforms, positioning them where they can bring their heavy weapons to bear while remaining protected by tactical squads. The dreadnought stands in place or moves slowly between firing positions, laying down suppressing fire, destroying enemy vehicles, performing all the tasks that a heavy weapons platform is supposed to perform. This is tactically sound, but it is also exactly the kind of combat that Orks find least engaging. From range, a dreadnought is just another gun emplacement, another source of incoming fire to be endured or avoided. The fact that this particular gun emplacement can move and has slightly better tactical judgment than a stationary weapon makes little difference to the orc experience of fighting it. The orc is being shot at by something that does not react personally to his presence, that does not engage in the give and take of combat. It might as well be a bunker or a tank for all the satisfaction it provides. Even dreadnoughts that do engage in melee combat often fail to provide the satisfaction orcs seek. The problem is that dreadnought melee combat is fundamentally different from the kind of combat orcs prefer. When two orcs fight, there is a constant exchange, a testing of strength and skill where both participants are fully engaged in trying to overcome the other. An orc can read his opponent's movements, can see the moment when his opponent realizes he is losing, can feel the satisfaction of proven superiority when his chopper finally finds its mark. Fighting a dreadnought in melee is nothing like this. The dreadnought's power fist strikes with devastating force, certainly, but it does so with mechanical regularity. There is no reading of movements, no psychological component to the combat. The dreadnought calculates optimal striking angles and executes them with precision. It does not tire, does not become discouraged, does not show any of the human elements that make combat meaningful to an orc. Even destroying a dreadnought in melee rarely provides the satisfaction of a true victory, because the dreadnought fights until its systems fail completely, showing no awareness of impending defeat, no moment of realization that it has been overcome. This is why orcs, despite their general enthusiasm for combat, often show a marked preference for engaging living space marines over dreadnoughts. A tactical marine, even one in full power armor, is still fundamentally a living warrior. He reacts to pain, shows fatigue, demonstrates fear or anger or determination in ways that an orc can recognize and respond to. Fighting a space marine, even one who is larger and stronger than the orc, provides the kind of visceral, personal combat that satisfies orcs' psychological needs. Fighting a dreadnought, even when victorious, often leaves the orc feeling as though something essential was missing from the experience. The WH energy itself seems to respond to this difference. Imperial observers have noted that orc forces fighting primarily against infantry, even elite infantry like space marines, maintain higher morale and combat effectiveness than orc forces fighting against heavily mechanized opponents. The energy of the WH, that psychic phenomenon that binds orcs together and amplifies their effectiveness, flows more strongly when orcs are engaged in satisfying combat. When forced to fight against machines, including dreadnoughts, that energy begins to dissipate, leaving orcs less coordinated, less effective, and more likely to seek better targets elsewhere. This creates an interesting tactical situation for Space Marine commanders. Deploying dreadnoughts against orcs is certainly effective in terms of raw combat power. A dreadnought can destroy orc mobs with frightening efficiency, and its armor can withstand tremendous punishment before failing. But dreadnoughts may actually be less effective at breaking an orc WH than infantry forces are, because dreadnoughts do not engage orcs in the kind of combat that orcs find meaningful. An orc mob that suffers heavy casualties fighting space marines may become more determined to prove themselves. That same mob suffering similar casualties against dreadnoughts may simply lose interest and redirect their attention to more satisfying targets. Some Space Marine chapters have recognized this phenomenon and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Rather than using dreadnoughts as primary combat units against orcs, they employ them as force multipliers, supporting infantry assaults with heavy weapons fire, while the actual fighting is done by tactical and assault squads. This gives the orcs the personal combat they crave, while still benefiting from the dreadnought's firepower. Other chapters, particularly those with limited understanding of orc psychology, continue to deploy dreadnoughts in their standard roles and wonder why their orc opponents seem less engaged than expected. But all of this is merely the groundwork for understanding the truly unique case of Alpha Legion dreadnoughts. If standard dreadnoughts, are already marginal opponents from an Ork perspective. If they already provide less satisfying combat than living warriors do, then Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts represent the extreme end of this spectrum. They are everything that makes Dreadnoughts unsatisfying opponents, amplified and refined through the Alpha Legion's particular operational philosophy. Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, the ultimate confusion. When the specific characteristics of Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts combine with the general Ork aversion to fighting machines, the result is a phenomenon that borders on the unique in 41st Millennium warfare. To understand why Orks won't fight Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, we must examine how these particular war machines differ from their cousins in other legions and chapters, and how those differences interact with Ork psychology in ways that make engagement fundamentally unappealing. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought is not merely a walking weapons platform housing a fallen warrior. It is a component in an elaborate system of misdirection and psychological manipulation. Every aspect of its design, deployment, and operation serves the Alpha Legion's core tactical principle. The enemy should never truly understand what they are fighting or why. Where other Dreadnoughts project identity, Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts project ambiguity. Where other Dreadnoughts inspire through their presence, Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts create doubt and confusion. This begins with the most basic question: who is actually interred within an Alpha Legion Dreadnought? For most chapters, this information is not only known, but celebrated. The Dreadnought bears the name and heraldry of its occupant, displays battle honors earned over centuries of service, and is recognized by all who see it as the continuing service of a specific, honored warrior. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought, by contrast, is deliberately anonymous. It may bear Legion heraldry, yes, but individual identification is conspicuously absent. The warrior within could be anyone, or the designation could change depending on operational requirements. This anonymity is not accidental or incidental. It is fundamental to how the Alpha Legion employs its Dreadnoughts. In an organization where even the Primarch's identity was deliberately obscured, where any warrior might claim to be Alpharius, extending this philosophy to Dreadnoughts makes perfect sense. The uncertainty about who occupies the sarcophagus becomes another tool in the Alpha Legion's arsenal of misdirection. Enemies cannot predict how the Dreadnought will behave because they cannot determine whose tactical thinking guides its actions. But the ambiguity goes deeper than mere identification. Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts are trained, to the extent that term applies to the warriors interred within them, to suppress their individual characteristics. Where another Legion's Dreadnought might have distinctive tactical preferences or combat patterns that reflect the personality of its occupant, an Alpha Legion Dreadnought deliberately adopts a generic operational profile. It behaves as any Alpha Legion Dreadnought might behave, which is to say, it behaves in whatever manner serves the immediate tactical objective while revealing as little as possible about itself. This extends to communication. Most Dreadnoughts, when they speak, project authority and wisdom through their artificial vox systems. Their words carry weight, reflecting centuries of experience and tactical knowledge. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought, however, communicates only when necessary, and even then in ways that maximize uncertainty. It might broadcast in multiple voices, or claim multiple identities, or respond to queries with deliberate ambiguity. The goal is never to inform or inspire, but to confuse and misdirect. In combat, these characteristics manifest in ways that are particularly troublesome for opponents seeking meaningful engagement. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought does not announce its presence or issue challenges. It does not seek glory or demonstration of individual prowess. It simply executes its tactical objectives with the minimum communication and maximum efficiency. To an enemy watching it operate, the Alpha Legion Dreadnought appears not as a warrior, but as a sophisticated weapons system, one that happens to possess some degree of tactical judgment but no discernible personality or individual agency. This is precisely the quality that makes Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts so unsatisfying as opponents for Orks. Remember, Orks can accept fighting machines when necessary, but they strongly prefer opponents who provide personal combat, who react and respond in ways that make the fight feel meaningful. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought deliberately eliminates all these qualities. It is maximally machine-like in its presentation, minimizing any indication that a living warrior guides its actions. Consider how an Alpha Legion Dreadnought behaves on the battlefield compared to, say, an Ultramarines Dreadnought. The Ultramarines Ancient might call out tactical advice to nearby squads, might declare its intentions before executing maneuvers, might respond to enemy taunts with declarations of Imperial superiority. These behaviors, while perhaps tactically unnecessary, serve important psychological functions. They remind everyone present, friend and foe alike, that the Dreadnought is not merely a machine, but a warrior continuing his service to the Emperor. They provide touchpoints for engagement, ways for enemies to relate to the Dreadnought as an opponent rather than merely an obstacle. The Alpha Legion Dreadnought does none of these things. It maintains Vox silence except for encrypted communications with other Alpha Legion forces. It maneuvers without warning or explanation. It engages targets based on some calculated priority that is never revealed to observers. When destroyed, it provides no final words, no dramatic declarations, just the mechanical failure of its systems. From an outside perspective, it might as well be an automated weapons platform for all the personality it displays. Now layer onto this the Alpha Legion's tactical employment of their dreadnoughts. Where other legions might deploy dreadnoughts as anchors or spearheads, as focal points around which battles are fought, the Alpha Legion uses its dreadnoughts as they use everything else, as elements in larger schemes of deception. An Alpha Legion dreadnought might be deployed not to win a particular engagement, but to create the appearance of an engagement, drawing enemy attention while the real Alpha Legion forces accomplish their objectives elsewhere. This means that engaging an Alpha Legion dreadnought rarely provides even the satisfaction of achieving a tactical victory. Destroy an Ultramarines dreadnought, and you have removed a significant asset from the enemy force, struck a blow that will be felt. Destroy an Alpha Legion dreadnought, and you may have just accomplished exactly what the Alpha Legion wanted you to accomplish, may have committed forces to a fight that served no purpose except to distract you from something more important happening elsewhere. The victory, if it can even be called that, is hollow because you can never be certain of its significance. For Orks, this represents a perfect storm of unsatisfying combat characteristics. The Alpha Legion dreadnought is mechanical in presentation, eliminating the personal element that Orks seek in combat. It is deployed in ways that deny satisfying engagement, either by maintaining distance or by fighting in patterns that feel mechanical rather than tactical. And even defeating it provides no clear sense of accomplishment, because the significance of that defeat is deliberately obscured by the Alpha Legion's operational methods. The WH40K energy, that psychic phenomenon that drives Ork effectiveness, requires satisfying combat to flourish. Orks need to feel that their fighting matters, that they are proving themselves against worthy opponents. Alpha Legion dreadnoughts deny them this feeling at every level. Fighting one is like fighting a shadow, or perhaps more accurately, like fighting a piece of battlefield equipment that happens to move and shoot, but provides no indication that defeating it matters, or that anyone even cares whether it is destroyed or not. Imperial observers who have witnessed battles between Orks and Alpha Legion forces have noted this phenomenon with something approaching academic interest. Ork mobs that would charge fearlessly into the teeth of Ultramarines' dreadnought fire show marked reluctance to engage Alpha Legion dreadnoughts. When forced to fight them, Orks do so with less enthusiasm, less coordination, less of the frenzied energy that normally characterizes their combat. And given any opportunity to disengage from fighting Alpha Legion dreadnoughts in favor of more satisfying targets, Orks will take it. This is not fear, it bears repeating. Orks do not fear mechanical opponents, they simply find them boring. and Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts represent the pinnacle of boring mechanical opponents, combining maximum machine-like presentation with tactical employment that denies any sense of meaningful engagement. To an Ork, fighting an Alpha Legion Dreadnought is like being forced to destroy a particularly dangerous but fundamentally uninteresting piece of equipment. It is a task to be completed if necessary, but never something to be sought out or enjoyed. The Alpha Legion, of course, is fully aware of this phenomenon and exploits it ruthlessly. They deploy their dreadnoughts in ways that maximize Ork disinterest, using them to screen movements, provide fire support from positions where Orks are unlikely to reach them, or simply as deterrents that Ork forces will avoid if given better options. The dreadnoughts become force multipliers not through their combat power alone, but through their ability to shape Ork behavior by being deliberately unsatisfying opponents. This represents psychological warfare at a level of sophistication that most opponents cannot match. The Alpha Legion is not merely fighting Orks. They are manipulating the fundamental psychological drives that make Orks what they are. They are using their intimate understanding of what Orks want from combat to create situations where Orks choose not to engage, or engage half-heartedly, or disengage at the first opportunity. And they accomplish this not through fear or superior firepower, but by being boring. The psychological warfare angle, exploiting Ork nature. The interaction between Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts and Ork psychology represents one of the more sophisticated applications of psychological warfare in the 41st millennium. While psychological warfare is common enough against more complex enemies, the fact that it works against Orks, beings often dismissed as simple brutes, speaks to the Alpha Legion's deep understanding of their opponents and their willingness to exploit any advantage, no matter how unconventional. The key to understanding this phenomenon lies in recognizing that psychological warfare does not require your enemy to be intelligent in the conventional sense, or even to be consciously aware they are being manipulated. It merely requires understanding what drives your enemy's behavior and creating conditions that exploit those drives. In the case of Orks, the primary driver is their need for satisfying combat, that visceral, immediate violence that validates their existence and feeds the wag. Deny them this satisfaction, and you reduce their effectiveness without firing a shot. The Alpha Legion understands this at a level that escapes most other forces in the galaxy. While Imperial Guard commanders might view Orks as mindless berserkers to be mowed down with massed fire, while Space Marine captains might see them as worthy opponents testing Imperial resolve, the Alpha Legion sees them as subjects for psychological manipulation. Every aspect of Ork behavior, from their preference for close combat to their need for visible results, becomes a potential vulnerability to be exploited. This exploitation begins long before any Alpha Legion dreadnought ever sets foot on a battlefield. The Alpha Legion's intelligence-gathering operations, those networks of human operatives and infiltration specialists that span the galaxy, pay particular attention to Ork movements and psychology. They study how particular war bosses make tactical decisions, what kinds of combat different Ork clans prefer, how the WAG energy flows and strengthens during various types of engagement. This knowledge informs every aspect of Alpha Legion operations against Orks. When the Alpha Legion chooses to deploy dreadnoughts against Ork forces, it is never a simple tactical decision based on the need for heavy weapons platforms. Instead, it is a calculated choice designed to shape Ork behavior in specific ways. The dreadnoughts are positioned not merely to provide effective fire, but to be unsatisfying targets, too distant for easy assault, too mechanical in their operations to inspire Ork enthusiasm for combat. The goal is not primarily to kill Orks, though of course the dreadnoughts will do so with efficiency, but rather to make the Orks not want to be there. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but the implications are profound. An enemy who is killed is simply removed from the battlefield. An enemy who loses interest in fighting, who begins to question why he is there, who starts looking for more satisfying combat elsewhere, becomes a vector for demoralization. And while orcs are remarkably resistant to conventional demoralization, they are highly susceptible to losing enthusiasm for unsatisfying combat. The WH energy that drives orc effectiveness is not merely a power source or a communication medium. It is fundamentally tied to orc psychology, growing stronger when orcs are engaged in the kind of combat they find meaningful and weakening when they are not. An orc force fighting Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts experiences a gradual diminishment of WH energy, not because they are losing, but because the combat itself fails to energize them. This manifests in increasingly poor coordination, more infighting among the orcs themselves, and a general degradation of combat effectiveness that has nothing to do with casualties inflicted. The Alpha Legion amplifies this effect through careful coordination of their operations. A single dreadnought providing fire support might be an annoyance to an orc force. Multiple dreadnoughts working in coordination, each one equally mechanical and unsatisfying, each one denying orcs the kind of combat they seek, becomes something more significant. The cumulative effect of fighting multiple opponents who provide no satisfaction begins to wear on even the most enthusiastic orc mob. But the truly sophisticated element of Alpha Legion's psychological warfare against orcs lies in what happens when orcs disengage from fighting the dreadnoughts. Most military forces would see enemy disengagement as a victory in itself, an opportunity to inflict casualties on a retreating foe. The Alpha Legion sees it as an opportunity for even more subtle manipulation. They allow orc forces to disengage, even facilitated by opening gaps in their lines or redirecting fire away from retreating orcs. This seems counterintuitive, letting enemies escape, but it serves several purposes. First, it reinforces the orc perception that fighting Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts is unrewarding. The orcs' attempted engagement found it unsatisfying, disengaged, and the Dreadnoughts didn't even care enough to pursue them aggressively. This sends a message, subliminal but powerful, that the Dreadnoughts are not worthy opponents, not enemies who care about proving their superiority. They are just machines doing a job, and orcs are beneath their notice. For beings whose self-worth is tied to proving themselves in combat, this is more insulting than any taunt could be. Second, allowing orc disengagement spreads the phenomenon. Orcs who have fought Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts and found the experience unsatisfying return to their tribes with this knowledge. While orcs are not particularly given to tactical, debriefing or strategic planning, they do share experiences, particularly experiences related to finding good fights. An orc who has fought Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts will communicate to his fellows, through words or actions or simple lack of enthusiasm, that these particular opponents are not worth seeking out. Third, and perhaps most cunningly, the Alpha Legion uses orc disengagement to manipulate the broader tactical situation. Orcs who disengage from fighting Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts must go somewhere, must find some other target for their aggression. The Alpha Legion, through careful positioning and intelligence gathering, often ensures that the most attractive alternative targets are ones that serve Alpha Legion interests. The orcs might redirect toward a rival Alpha Legion cell that the Legion once purged, or toward an Imperial force that the Alpha Legion once weakened, or simply toward a position where they will be less troublesome to Alpha Legion operations. This is psychological warfare, elevated to strategic manipulation. The Alpha Legion is not merely winning battles against orcs, they are steering orc behavior across entire campaigns, or even star systems. They turn the orc need for satisfying combat into a lever for moving orc forces like pieces on a game board. And they do it all while maintaining the appearance of simple, unremarkable combat operations featuring dreadnoughts, providing fire support. The sophistication of this approach becomes even more apparent when we consider how it differs from other forces' attempts to psychologically manipulate orcs. Most enemies who try to demoralize orcs do so through intimidation, through demonstrations of overwhelming power meant to make the Orks realize they cannot win. This rarely works, because Orks are remarkably unconcerned with odds or survival. An Ork who believes he is facing certain death might still charge into combat, because dying in a good fight is preferable to living through a boring one. The Alpha Legion approach is fundamentally different. They do not try to intimidate Orks or convince them they cannot win. Instead, they make Orks not want to fight in the first place by making the fight itself unrewarding. This bypasses Ork fearlessness entirely, targeting instead their deeper psychological need for meaningful combat. An Ork can face death without hesitation, but an Ork facing the prospect of boring combat will look for alternatives. Even more impressively, this approach works despite the Orks having no conscious awareness of being manipulated. An Ork does not think to himself, "The Alpha Legion is psychologically manipulating me by deploying unsatisfying opponents." He simply experiences the combat as unrewarding and makes the instinctive decision to seek better fights elsewhere. The manipulation operates at a level below conscious thought, targeting the fundamental drives that govern Ork behavior. This is warfare as the Alpha Legion practices it in its purest form, achieving objectives through understanding and manipulation rather than through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They do not need to kill every Ork to defeat an Ork wag. They merely need to make the Orks lose interest in fighting them, to redirect Ork aggression toward other targets or toward each other, and they accomplish this through careful deployment of assets, including Dreadnoughts, in ways that exploit Ork psychology with surgical precision. The implications of this go beyond simple battlefield tactics. If the Alpha Legion can manipulate Ork behavior so effectively, what else might they accomplish through similar understanding of other species' psychology? If they can turn the Ork love of combat into a weakness, what vulnerabilities might they exploit in more sophisticated enemies? These questions trouble Imperial strategists who have studied Alpha Legion methods, because the answers suggest that the Alpha Legion's true threat lies not in their combat power, but in their understanding of how to make enemies defeat themselves. Historical encounters and evidence. While the phenomenon of Orks avoiding Alpha Legion dreadnoughts is well established among those few Imperial scholars who study such matters, concrete evidence of specific encounters is frustratingly rare. This rarity is itself telling, reflecting both the secretive nature of Alpha Legion operations and the fact that battles where Orks refuse to engage properly are less likely to generate the kind of dramatic records that find their way into Imperial archives. Nevertheless, careful examination of various sources reveals several documented cases that illuminate this unusual tactical phenomenon. One of the earliest recorded instances comes from the Horus Heresy itself, during the chaotic period when the Alpha Legion's true allegiances were most ambiguous. Fragmentary records from the campaign on Yarant describe an Ork warband that had been raiding Imperial supply lines, encountering what appeared to be a small Alpha Legion force, including at least 2 Contemptor-pattern dreadnoughts. The Orks, displaying their typical enthusiasm for combat, initially charged the Alpha Legion positions with their usual disregard for casualties. What happened next is where the account becomes interesting. According to Imperial Guard observers who witnessed the engagement from a distance, the Ork assault began to falter not because of casualties, which were actually relatively light compared to typical Ork operations, but because the Orks seemed to lose interest in the fight. The Alpha Legion dreadnoughts maintained distance, provided supporting fire, but never engaged in the kind of close-quarters combat that Orks prefer. More significantly, they showed no response to Ork challenges, no individual behavior that might mark them as worthy opponents rather than merely dangerous machines. Within several hours, the Ork force had largely disengaged, not in rout but in what appeared to be frustration or boredom. The war boss was observed redirecting his forces toward a nearby PDF position, apparently deciding that fighting unaugmented humans would provide more satisfaction than continuing to engage the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion, for their part, made no effort to pursue or prevent this redirection, seemingly content to let the Orks go. The PDF position was overrun within days, though whether this served some Alpha Legion objective remains unclear. A more recent account comes from Inquisitor Valeria Krenz of the Ordo Xenos, who studied Ork behavioral patterns in the Segmentum Obscurus for several decades before her disappearance in 987.41. Her final report, recovered from a data cache years after her loss, described what she termed the Dreadnought paradox. She had observed multiple instances of Ork forces engaging various Space Marine chapters, and noted marked differences in Ork behavior depending on how those chapters employed their Dreadnoughts. When fighting chapters that deployed Dreadnoughts aggressively, using them as assault units or close combat specialists, Orks showed their typical enthusiasm for engagement. But in several cases, involving chapters that she suspected might be Alpha Legion cells operating under false colors, Ork forces displayed what she called tactical disinterest. The Orks would initiate combat, determine that their enemies were providing unsatisfying engagement, and redirect toward other targets, sometimes in the middle of ongoing battles. Kren's most detailed account described a campaign on Talassar 4, where a warband bearing Alpha Legion heraldry defended an apparently unimportant industrial facility against a substantial Ork WH40K. The Alpha Legion force included at least 4 Dreadnoughts of various patterns, all deployed in fire support roles, providing overlapping fields of fire. The Orks assaulted the facility repeatedly over several weeks, but each assault seemed to lose momentum not through Alpha Legion resistance, but through Ork disinterest. What made this case particularly interesting was that Krenz had managed to interrogate several captured Orks from the attacking force. Their accounts, filtered through the primitive Ork dialect and translated into High Gothic, consistently described the Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts as boring gits and not proper fights. One Nob, when asked why he didn't press attacks against the Dreadnoughts that were inflicting the most casualties on his mob, responded that they don't fight back proper like, just stand there shooting, no fun in it. This testimony is particularly valuable because it comes directly from Orks themselves, providing insight into their subjective experience of fighting Alpha Legion forces. The Nob's comment that the Dreadnoughts don't fight back proper like is especially telling, suggesting that the issue is not the Dreadnoughts' effectiveness, but rather their manner of engagement. They inflict casualties, certainly, but they do so in a way that fails to satisfy the Ork psychological need for personal combat. Another documented case comes from the records of the Ultramarines' 4th Company, which engaged an Ork, WH40K, on Quintan's world in 823-41. The Ultramarines were not directly fighting Alpha Legion forces, but they observed Ork behavior around a crashed spacecraft that intelligence suggested might be an Alpha Legion vessel. The wreck contained at least 2 severely damaged Dreadnoughts that were still partially operational, providing defensive fire against anyone who approached. What intrigued the Ultramarines' observers was that the Orks, who had been enthusiastically looting other battlefield wreckage, showed no interest in assaulting the Alpha Legion wreck, despite it likely containing valuable salvage. The Dreadnoughts were clearly vulnerable, damaged enough that a determined Ork assault would almost certainly overwhelm them, yet the Orks repeatedly bypassed the wreck in favor of other targets. When questioned, Ultramarines Captain Ventris noted in his report that the Xenos seemed to lack their typical enthusiasm for combat when facing these particular opponents, suggesting tactical wisdom that contradicts their usual behavior. This assessment, while understandable from a Space Marine commander's perspective, likely misses the actual dynamic. The Orks were not displaying tactical wisdom by avoiding vulnerable opponents. They were displaying their characteristic preference for satisfying combat. The damaged Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, even more machine-like than their fully functional counterparts, held no appeal as opponents. The Orks could tell, on some instinctive level, that destroying them would provide no satisfaction, would not prove anything worth proving. Perhaps the most comprehensive evidence comes from a classified Ordo Malleus report, compiled by Inquisitor Lord Hephaestus Crack, following the Caloris campaign of 956.M41. This campaign saw multiple factions, including Orks, various Chaos warbands, Imperial forces, and what Craik identified as at least 3 separate Alpha Legion cells, fighting over a cluster of strategically important worlds. The chaos of the campaign created a natural experiment in how different Ork tribes responded to different opponents. Craik's analysis, based on battlefield observations, captured Ork communications and testimony from Imperial Guard units that had observed Ork movements, revealed a clear pattern. Ork forces consistently showed less enthusiasm for engaging Alpha Legion units, particularly those that employed Dreadnoughts in support roles. In several instances, Ork warbands that had been pursuing Alpha Legion forces broke off their pursuit when it became clear the Alpha Legion intended to fight primarily through indirect means and long-range fire. What made Crack's report particularly valuable was his theoretical framework for understanding this behavior. He proposed that Orks evaluate potential combat not just on tactical considerations, but on satisfaction metrics that determined how rewarding a particular fight would be. Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, by deliberately minimizing their individual presence and operating as impersonal weapons platforms, scored poorly on these metrics, making them unattractive targets for Ork aggression. This theoretical framework has proven influential among the small number of Imperial strategists who study Ork behavior at this level of detail. It provides a way to understand not just why Orks avoid Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts specifically, but why they show preferences among opponents more generally. The Orks are not making purely tactical decisions about which enemies to fight. They are making quasi-emotional decisions about which fights will satisfy their psychological needs. More anecdotal evidence comes from Space Marine chapters that have fought alongside or observed Alpha Legion operations. The Raven Guard, whose own preference for stealth and indirect warfare gives them some understanding of Alpha Legion methods, have noted in several campaign reports that Ork forces demonstrate unusual restraint when engaging suspected Alpha Legion units. The Raven Guard, being familiar with psychological warfare, understand that this restraint is being deliberately provoked through Alpha Legion operational methods. Similarly, the Iron Hands, with their emphasis on mechanical augmentation and rational analysis, have compiled extensive data on combat efficiency against various xeno-species. Their records show that Ork forces facing their Dreadnoughts, which the Iron Hands deploy aggressively as assault units, demonstrate typical Ork combat patterns. But in the few instances where Iron Hands forces observed Ork Alpha Legion engagements, they noted that the Xenos showed approximately 43% less engagement intensity than baseline measurements would predict. This quantitative approach, so characteristic of the Iron Hands, provides additional evidence for the phenomenon from a different analytical perspective. The Orks are not merely avoiding Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts in some vague sense. They are measurably less engaged, less enthusiastic, less effective when forced to fight them. The difference is significant enough to be captured in statistical analysis, suggesting that this is a robust and reproducible phenomenon rather than mere chance or observer bias. Even among Chaos forces, there are accounts that touch on this phenomenon. A captured World Eater's berserker, interrogated about his warband's experiences fighting Orks, mentioned an occasion when both his forces and an Ork WH40K had been competing for control of the same territory. An Alpha Legion cell was also operating in the area, and the berserker noted with contempt that the Orks wouldn't even fight them proper, kept going after us instead, even though the Hydra's servants were the bigger threat. This testimony is particularly interesting because it comes from a source that has no reason to fabricate or exaggerate, and indeed might be expected to minimize Alpha Legion effectiveness out of contempt for their methods. Yet even this hostile witness confirms the pattern. Orks preferentially engaged the World Eaters, who provided the kind of straightforward, brutal combat Orks prefer, rather than the Alpha Legion, whose methods proved unsatisfying despite potentially representing a greater strategic threat. Taken together, These various accounts and analyses paint a consistent picture. Across different time periods, different sectors of the galaxy, different Ork tribes, and different Alpha Legion cells, the same pattern emerges. Orks, when given a choice, avoid engaging Alpha Legion forces in general, and Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts in particular. When forced to engage, they do so with less enthusiasm and effectiveness than their baseline behavior would predict. And when given any opportunity to disengage in favor of more satisfying combat, they take it. This consistency across multiple independent sources and observers suggests that we are dealing with a genuine phenomenon, not coincidence or observer bias. The Alpha Legion has discovered, perhaps through systematic study, or perhaps through their characteristic trial and error approach to warfare, a way to exploit Ork psychology that makes their forces, and particularly their dreadnoughts, fundamentally unattractive opponents. In doing so, they have achieved something that many Imperial commanders would consider impossible, making Orks choose not to fight. The bigger picture, strategic implications. The phenomenon of Orks refusing to engage Alpha Legion dreadnoughts might seem, at first glance, to be merely a tactical curiosity, an interesting footnote in the broader history of Xenos-Chaos interactions. But a deeper examination reveals implications that extend far beyond any single battlefield or campaign. What we are observing is nothing less than a fundamental redefinition of how warfare can be prosecuted in the 41st millennium, and what it means when psychological manipulation proves more effective than firepower. Consider first the implications for Imperial defensive strategy. The Imperium faces innumerable threats across 1 million worlds, and Ork incursions represent a persistent and dangerous drain on military resources. Traditional Imperial doctrine for dealing with Ork WH40Ks involves massive commitment of forces, overwhelming firepower, and acceptance of horrific casualties. The goal is simple: kill enough Orks quickly enough to break the momentum of the WAG before it can gain sufficient mass to threaten entire sectors. The Alpha Legion approach suggests an alternative paradigm. Instead of defeating Orks through superior force, one might defeat them by making them not want to fight. Instead of matching Ork numbers with Imperial Guard regiments numbering in the millions, one might redirect Ork aggression toward other enemies, or toward the Orks themselves. This is not merely more efficient, it represents a fundamentally different conception of what victory means. But the Imperium, with its rigid doctrinal thinking and suspicion of anything that smacks of chaos taint, is institutionally incapable of adopting such methods. The very idea of deliberately making one's forces less appealing as opponents goes against every principle of Space Marine combat doctrine. The Adeptus Astartes are supposed to be the Emperor's finest warriors, the terror of his enemies, the tip of the spear that breaks enemy formations. The notion that they should instead present themselves as boring, unsatisfying opponents is antithetical to everything the Space Marines represent. This inability to adapt, this doctrinal rigidity, represents a significant strategic weakness for the Imperium. The Alpha Legion, freed from loyalty to the Emperor and unrestricted by the Codex Astartes or any other doctrinal framework, can employ methods that achieve superior results with fewer casualties and less resource expenditure. They win not because they are better fighters than other Space Marines, though they certainly are formidable warriors, but because they are willing to fight in ways that other forces find dishonorable or distasteful. The implications extend beyond the Imperium to the broader galactic strategic situation. If the Alpha Legion can manipulate Ork behavior so effectively, if they can turn the Ork love of combat into a lever for controlling Ork movements, then they possess a form of soft power that most other factions lack. They can, in theory, redirect entire Ork WAGs toward their enemies, or away from their objectives, without ever engaging in direct combat. This has been observed in several theaters where Alpha Legion activity is suspected. Ork WAGs that should, by all logical analysis, assault certain worlds or engage certain enemy forces instead, mysteriously redirect toward different targets. Imperial intelligence services have long suspected Alpha Legion involvement in such redirections, but proving it is nearly impossible given the Legion's operational security. The Orks themselves would be unaware of being manipulated, experiencing only the instinctive preference for more satisfying combat. This raises disturbing questions about how many seemingly random Ork incursions might actually be the result of Alpha Legion manipulation. When an Ork wag appears out of nowhere to assault an Imperial world, is it really random, or has the Alpha Legion subtly shepherded that wagi toward that particular target? When Ork tribes clash with each other rather than presenting a united front against Imperial forces, is it natural Ork behavior, or have Alpha Legion operatives inflamed existing tensions? The answers to these questions could significantly alter how Imperial strategists assess threat levels and allocate defensive resources. From the Chaos perspective, the Alpha Legion's methods represent both an opportunity and a threat. Other Chaos warbands could potentially adopt similar approaches, using their understanding of enemy psychology to achieve victories without relying purely on demonic support or superior firepower. But this would require a level of discipline and long-term planning that most Chaos forces lack. The World Eaters, for instance, could never employ such methods because their devotion to Khorne demands direct, brutal combat. The Death Guard, while tactically sophisticated, are too straightforward in their approach to warfare to embrace the Alpha Legion's level of deception. This creates an interesting dynamic within the Chaos forces themselves. The Alpha Legion's effectiveness through psychological manipulation makes them valuable allies when their interests align with those of other Chaos warbands, but their methods also make them deeply distrusted. How can you trust an ally who might be manipulating you as thoroughly as they manipulate their enemies? This mutual suspicion serves the Alpha Legion's purposes, keeping other Chaos forces off balance and unable to effectively counter Alpha Legion schemes. For the Orks themselves, the implications are perhaps most troubling from a certain perspective. The Ork species has endured for millions of years through sheer resilience and adaptability. They have survived the war in heaven, the rise and fall of countless empires, and every attempt by every species to eradicate them. Their simple psychology, their straightforward approach to existence, has proven remarkably robust across these vast spans of time. But the Alpha Legion has discovered a vulnerability in that psychology, a way to turn the Orks' greatest strength, their love of combat, into a weakness. This is not a temporary tactical advantage, but a fundamental exploit of Ork nature. As long as Orks crave satisfying combat, as long as they prefer visceral violence to clinical elimination of targets, they will be vulnerable to forces that understand how to deny them that satisfaction. This vulnerability is particularly significant because it cannot be easily addressed. Ork psychology is not learned, but genetically encoded, passed down from those ancient Krork created by the Old Ones. Changing it would require rewriting the fundamental programming that makes Orks what they are. Even if such a thing were possible, the result would no longer really be Orks, but some new species with different characteristics and different strengths and weaknesses. The Alpha Legion's exploitation of this vulnerability also raises questions about what other species' psychology might be similarly exploited. Humans have their own psychological drives and preferences that shape how they wage war. The Tau have their philosophical commitments to the greater good that influence their tactical decisions. The Eldar have their emotional complexity and their fear of Slanesh that affects their strategic choices. If the Alpha Legion can manipulate Orks so effectively, what might they achieve against these other species through similar understanding and exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities? This question is particularly troubling because it suggests that the Alpha Legion's true strength lies not in their combat capabilities, but in their understanding of how different species think and feel and react. They have effectively weaponized psychology itself, turning the fundamental nature of different species into vulnerabilities to be exploited. This is warfare at a level of sophistication that most factions in the 41st millennium cannot match, because it requires not just military prowess, but deep insight into how minds work. The final implication concerns the very nature of warfare in the Dark Millennium. Traditional military thinking, whether Imperial, Chaos, or Xenos, focuses on force multiplication, on making your forces more effective at killing the enemy. The Alpha Legion's approach suggests an alternative, making the enemy less willing to fight in the first place. This is not demoralization in the conventional sense, not making the enemy afraid or convinced they cannot win. It is something more subtle, making the enemy find the combat itself unrewarding enough that they seek alternatives. If this approach can work against Orks, being specifically engineered for warfare, then it might work against any enemy. The implications for how wars are fought, how victories are achieved, how strategic objectives are pursued, could be revolutionary. Instead of committing vast armies to grinding attritional warfare, forces might achieve objectives by carefully shaping enemy behavior through psychological manipulation. Instead of destroying enemy forces through superior firepower, commanders might redirect those forces toward other targets or toward their own destruction through internal conflict. This represents a form of warfare that the Imperium, with its rigid doctrines and suspicion of anything innovative, is institutionally incapable of adopting. But it is precisely the kind of warfare at which the Alpha Legion excels, and it may prove decisive in determining the fate of the galaxy in the ages to come. The Orks won't fight Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, and in this simple fact lies a profound truth about the nature of war itself in the darkness of the far future. Conclusion. Lessons from the void. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, we might expect that every faction, every force, every warrior would fight every other with unrestricted fury. The galaxy burns with endless conflict. Species clash in battles that dwarf the comprehension of mortal minds, and the very existence of countless worlds hangs in the balance of these struggles. And yet, in this maelstrom of violence, we find an anomaly. Orks, who will fight anyone anywhere for any reason, who charge into certain death with raucous laughter, who view warfare as the very purpose of existence, refuse to engage. Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts with their characteristic enthusiasm. This phenomenon, which we have examined from multiple angles, from the psychology of the Ork species to the tactics of the Alpha Legion, from historical evidence to strategic implications, reveals truths that extend far beyond the specific case of these particular combatants. It shows us that warfare in the 41st millennium is not merely about firepower and tactics, not simply about who has the bigger guns or the better strategic position. It shows us that understanding your enemy, truly understanding what drives them and what they seek, can be as powerful as any weapon. The Orks were engineered by the Old Ones as the ultimate warriors, beings who need combat as humans need air, who grow stronger through violence, who are psychologically incapable of fear in the conventional sense. And yet the Alpha Legion has found a way to make these perfect warriors not want to fight, not through intimidation or superior force, but through simply being boring. By presenting themselves, and particularly their dreadnoughts, as unsatisfying opponents, the Alpha Legion denies Orks the visceral combat they crave, and in doing so, achieves victory without even trying to win in the conventional sense. This is psychological warfare refined to its purest form. The Alpha Legion does not need to kill every Ork to defeat an Ork wag. They merely need to make the Orks lose interest in fighting them, to redirect that boundless Ork aggression toward other targets or toward the Orks themselves. They accomplish this not through complex manipulation or elaborate schemes, though those are certainly part of their repertoire, but through the simple expedient of understanding what Orks want from combat and deliberately failing to provide it. The broader implications of this phenomenon touch on fundamental questions about the nature of warfare and conflict in the galaxy. If the Orks, beings specifically designed for combat, can be manipulated so effectively, what does this say about other species? What vulnerabilities lie hidden in human psychology? waiting to be exploited by forces that understand how to manipulate fear, loyalty, ambition, or any other fundamental drive. What weaknesses might the Tau's commitment to the greater good represent, or the Eldar's emotional complexity, or the Tyrannid's hive mind? These questions haunt Imperial strategists who have studied the phenomenon, though their numbers are few and their voices often ignored by a military establishment that prefers to rely on proven doctrines and overwhelming force. The Imperium, for all its vast armies and ancient wisdom, seems constitutionally incapable of adopting the kind of psychological warfare that the Alpha Legion practices so effectively. This represents a significant strategic weakness, a vulnerability that the Alpha Legion and potentially other enemies could exploit. For the Orks themselves, this phenomenon reveals both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Their simple psychology, their straightforward love of combat, has allowed them to endure and thrive for millions of years. They do not suffer from the doubts and fears that plague more complex species. They do not agonize over moral questions or strategic dilemmas. They fight because fighting is what they were made to do, and this simplicity has proven remarkably effective across vast spans of time. But that same simplicity is also a vulnerability. Their need for satisfying combat, for visceral violence, and immediate feedback can be exploited by enemies who understand how to deny them that satisfaction. The Alpha Legion has discovered this vulnerability and exploits it ruthlessly, turning the Orks' greatest strength into a weakness through the simple expedient of being deliberately unsatisfying opponents. The Dreadnoughts at the center of this phenomenon represent the perfect expression of the Alpha Legion's philosophy. Where other legions use Dreadnoughts to project power and inspire their forces, the Alpha Legion uses them as tools for manipulation and control. Where other Dreadnoughts proudly proclaim their identity and heritage, Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts are deliberately anonymous, unknowable, machine-like. This is not weakness or lack of honor, as some might claim, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how to wage war at a level that transcends simple combat. The fact that this works, that Orks genuinely do avoid Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts when given the choice, demonstrates that warfare in the 41st millennium is far more complex than it might appear on the surface. It is not enough to be strong, to be well-armed, to be tactically proficient. True mastery of warfare requires understanding your enemies at a fundamental level, knowing what drives them, what they seek, what they fear, or desire, or need. The Alpha Legion has achieved this understanding with respect to Orks, and likely with respect to many other species as well. This raises disturbing questions about the nature of the conflicts that rage across the galaxy. How many battles are being fought, not because strategic necessity demands them, but because some hidden force has manipulated the participants into fighting? How many Ork wags have been subtly redirected toward targets that serve Alpha Legion interests? How many Imperial campaigns have been influenced by Alpha Legion operatives working within Imperial organizations? We cannot know, and perhaps we are not meant to know. The Alpha Legion's greatest weapon is doubt, the uncertainty that prevents enemies from trusting their own perceptions and judgments. What we can know, what the evidence clearly demonstrates, is that the Orks won't fight Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts, not because they cannot or because they fear them, but because those Dreadnoughts provide none of the satisfaction that Orks seek from combat. This simple fact, this tactical anomaly, opens a window into the deeper truths about warfare, psychology, and the nature of conflict in the Dark Millennium. It shows us that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not through superior force, but through superior understanding, not through killing your enemies, but through making them not want to fight you in the first place. As the galaxy continues its descent into ever greater chaos, as the forces of disorder and destruction press in from every side, as humanity and all the other species of the cosmos fight for survival against impossible odds, the lesson of the Alpha Legion Dreadnoughts remains relevant. Understand your enemy, exploit their weaknesses, Win not by being stronger, but by being smarter. And sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is simply be boring enough that your enemies would rather fight someone else. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even in that darkness, even in that endless conflict, the manner of warfare matters. The Alpha Legion has understood this truth, and in their Dreadnoughts, those walking tombs of anonymity and mechanical precision, they have created the perfect expression of it. The Orks, those green-skinned terrors who live for battle, have met their match not in superior firepower or tactical genius, but in simple, calculated, deliberate boredom. And in this, we see perhaps the darkest truth of all, that warfare is not merely about destruction, but about understanding, and that the side which truly understands its enemies will ultimately prevail. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40k's most fascinating tactical anomalies, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. The grim darkness of the far future contains countless such mysteries, and we'll continue to explore them, bringing you the lore, the tactics, and the hidden truths that make this universe so endlessly compelling. Until next time, stay vigilant, trust no one, and remember, in the 41st millennium, sometimes the greatest victories come not from the biggest guns, but from the smartest minds, for the Emperor and for the truth, wherever it may lead.